right. We'll be continuing our podcast in regards to world history with our, again, for the, I don't know how many times I've said it in the last few episodes, our walking encyclopedia, Major Wilson. From what I recall, the last time we were talking about...
Sorry.
It's good. From last time I recall, we were talking about Napoleon, am I right?
Yeah, we ended off. I probably shortchanged the American Revolution somewhat at the in the last discussion, and fast forwarded to Napoleon to try and set the stage for today's conversation about the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Do you want to revisit a few topics then?
We ended up with Napoleon, and I was kind of talking about how the world had never seen, or at least hadn't recorded, the type of operations and the type of warfare that he waged across the European continent from pretty much 1793 to 1815, and then where he stood as kind of those conflicts and his operations, and how they, I think, coupled with the kind of the tenor of the period of Enlightenment, spurred so much philosophical debate and discussion, not just on warfare itself, but on a whole host of topics. Plenty of writers coming from that period of time that we still quote. Jomini, Clausewitz, Tolstoy, all writing about that period of time and the profound effects that conflict had on society and had on the European continent.
Because Napoleon, he did everything.
More or less, yes, and that's kind of the basis in discussion, really, between Tolstoy and Clausewitz. It's kind of interesting to see their competing takes on it, because Clausewitz alludes to a military genius, and the example that he would have would be kind of Frederick the Great and then Napoleon, whereas Tolstoy more focused on the spirit of a nation as the driving factor in any society's accomplishments.
So what did you want to start off with then today?
So we ended with that, and 1815 is kind of the end of the Napoleonic conflicts. He's banished to some island, St. Helena, I think it is, somewhere out off the west coast of South America, and he lives out the rest of his days out there. That's 1815, and then, of course, 1860 is the start of the American Civil War. Really, in that time period between 1850 and 1815 and 1860, the country is it's a young nation, and it's growing into itself, but it's not. Those things obviously aren't happening easily or without conflict and without combat. So I really, the Civil War is it's fascinating to me. It's I think I've said this a few times, but my personal view of the American Civil War is that whatever stands for global society 3,000 years from now, whether there's a United States of America or not, or whatever's left, I think that they'll look back on the American Civil War kind of the way that I started this whole thing with how we still study Thucydides, but they'll look back on the American Civil War, and it will be a topic of discussion and a topic of learning for thousands of years on how a society reconciles what it says it is, what it really is, and how a society decides on its rights and on its place in the world. And I just think it's such a compelling and fascinating period of time.
Well, what makes the American Civil War? Because there's civil wars throughout history, right?
Right.
So what makes the American Civil War any different than these kind of civil wars, even modern civil wars?
To me, it's because of the outcome of it. Had the Civil War not ended the way that it would have, there'd be two. There'd probably be two countries on that continent, and neither one of those countries would have been able, as two separate countries, accomplish what the United States did in the following 100 years, especially when you look at, World War I, World War II, and then you look at our place in the world right now, everything would be different. We probably wouldn't be sitting here on this island doing what we're doing in the organization that we're doing it for the country that we're doing it for, and who knows what would be here in our place. And call me prejudicial to being an American, but I think that we are doing everything we can in the best interests of mankind, the best interests of what we understand as what the founders called natural law and natural rights. Again, that's just my prejudicial viewpoint. But
I mean, it's a fair point. You're absolutely right. Who knows what the outcome, how history would differ with the outcome of it. Yeah. I'm pretty happy with what it's been so far as like our accomplishments as a country since then. So
I mean, it's easy to say coulda, shoulda, woulda, or craft a counter narrative that says things could have been better, but at the same time,
it could have been so much worse.
Yes, and it's compelling to. It's just, to me, it's so compelling to study these characters, to study Abraham Lincoln and Grant and Sherman and this conflict. So the conflict itself, you gotta back up to who these men were that fought in it, and really there's the precursor to the Civil War is the Mexican-American War, fought in 1847, and there's conversations in that, or there's the purposes for that war. It really revolved around a lot of what I've read and what I've kind of understand is that revolved around the expansion of the United States, which creates more states and more senators in the South to create more votes in Congress to either preserve laws as are, or to make new laws that are advantageous to that, to that part of the country. Whether or not that's the actual reason, that's definitely one of the causal factors in the subsequent actions that led to the Civil War. But outside of that, the folks fighting in it, I mean, they're West Point graduates. Grant's a lieutenant. Lee is a lieutenant colonel. They kind of know each other. They're all serving in the same army. Some of these guys are friends. Some of these guys are incredible friends. Grant's close friends with this guy named Pemberton that we'll talk about later on in the Civil War. But for me, when I've got older and I think about my friends, my brothers and sisters in the military, these are folks that you just inherently trust. Like you and I mean, we've known each other for a couple weeks, and to call it friends is almost cheapens it a little bit, because there's friends that I can go hang out with, but the older I've gotten, the more I really reflect on how special this whole experience it is. I think about the Corporal Carawan sitting across the desk from me. Who's Corporal Carawan to me? I know that he would go out under fire and carry me off the battlefield. We've known each other for a couple weeks.
Absolutely.
You're a corporal. I'm a major, but I just know that that's a fact, and that's a powerful thing.
Well, we're enveloped in the same kind of lifestyle and society, and with the same people that we have the pleasure of serving with and under and or above. And of course, absolutely, and it's like a weird form of family.
It is. It's something wholly unto itself. But
I sorry.
No,
I was gonna say I feel more comfortable. As sad as it sounds, like I feel more comfortable sometimes like around Marines than I do like my own families, which is kind of sad when you think about it. Those Christmas holidays at home aren't exactly the same as those barracks grill outs right outside.
Yeah, it's a special, it's a special thing that just becomes an indelible part of who you are, and you get older and you mature and you reflect on things and you realize how special these things were, whether you did it. Something I'd talk about when I was a company commander, it was whether you do this for 4 years or 40 years, the people that serve their country, they should never wonder whether or not they've done anything beyond their own self-interest, because they have. And and that's why I think you see so many veterans move on to very successful leadership positions within their communities, and people that are doing, that have found the joy in serving for something beyond just their own self-interest, and continue to find ways to do that in their society.
Mm-hmm.
And so, going back to the Mexican-American War, though, so that's setting the baseline. That's the environment, though, with all these generals that are going to fight against each other, and all these leaders that are going to fight against each other,
mm-hmm.
In the coming decades. They are that society right now in this conflict in Mexico. But there's so much. The Civil War is so compelling too, because it's a common language. There's no translation of anybody's ideas or plans or what they knew going into it, or who they were, or where they came from. One of the greatest books, ever. Greatest military book you could. One of the greatest ones you could possibly read is Grant's memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't hurt that Mark Twain helped him write it, and Mark Twain is one of the most gifted writers of the English language that's ever lived. But there's a copy out there as well that was released a couple years ago by Dr. Elizabeth Samet, and so she annotates this book because she is a professor of English at West Point. She has all the access to all the history and knowledge of all these events that Grant discusses in his book. And Grant talks at length about his experience in the Mexican-American War, and she can point out his experiences there and speculate on the things that he learned as a young soldier that he was able to reapply as he progressed during the Civil War. One of them is, operations. One point there is operation against Veracruz, Mexico, and they cut their supply lines. They went inland. They did not maintain a line of communication to the sea. They lived off the land to conduct this siege of Veracruz, and that was wholly contradictory to military doctrine at the time. And so that in and of itself is fascinating. And when I fast forward to Vicksburg, I'll bring that back up. But now going back to Napoleon and that area, so one of Napoleon's kind of marshals, kind of secretaries was this French guy named Jomini, and he tried to take what he learned from watching Napoleon and summarize it into dictums about how to conduct military operations. Very kind of scientific, very objective in it, and the way that he crafted it. Terms like lines of communication, objectives, lines of operation, those are all Jominian terms. He published this book, and a professor at West Point in the call it 1830s, I think 32 was the year, I can't remember for sure, but is this guy named Mahan. And Mahan read this book and he said, this is brilliant. This is, everything we can learn from fighting in Europe. This is going to be West Point curriculum. So you have the Grants and kind of the younger officers that actually are educated in this stuff. And then you have Lee, a little bit older. He's probably 15-ish years older than Grant, and he did not have Jomini at West Point. So I find those things fascinating because this older generation that didn't have a educational, philosophical education on what had occurred in Europe, that had captivated Europe with Napoleon. You almost see them a little bit more
underexperienced.
I wouldn't go that far. I would call it less risk averse than this younger generation, the Grants and the McClellans and some of the younger Union officers. And so
knowledge kind of like developed a remedy for that generation gap, in it, you could say.
I think the thing to learn more than anything is the utility of understanding doctrine, but not being beholden to it to a fault.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding it, knowing it, and making a conscious deviation from it when a situation transpires for which the doctrine may not have wholly accounted for.
Okay.
And not just, hey, this is the doctrine, so this is the only way that we're going to do it. I think there's a General Mattis quote about doctrine being something about the. It's a very Mattis quote that belittles doctrine, even though he probably knew more of it than anybody else on the battlefield at any time.
It's a quote that makes me want to sing the Marines hymn. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, something like that. So again, still kind of on the Mexican-American War. Grant's educated in this foundation that worked for Napoleon, right? He's educated in it, but then he goes to war and it's not used. And it's not used, and he's successful. And it's not used, and it's successful. And so in Samet's version of the memoir, she does a lot of annotation that discusses that point, which I think is a fascinating point of, okay, you have this curriculum at the only military school in the time, and it's the information coming in is found to be fascinating and compelling. So it's taught to the students, and then it's not used on the battlefield, and it's not used, and because it's not used or willingly disregarded, and the battle is successful, you have this license of kind of free will. May be too powerful of a word for it, but I think a very American way of waging war, which is having a doctrine but not being beholden to it to a fault, and always emphasizing the ideas and the good ideas of subordinate elements, the good ideas of people on the battlefield to deal with the situation as it arises, and a recognition that each situation is going to be unique, and all doctrine does for us is it gives us kind of a common concept so that we can use this concept to deviate off of when we're trying to describe what it is we're supposed to do, but not this common concept that is the answer in every circumstance, regardless of any kind of compelling factors. So that's what I like that part of the story, because that's what Grant learns. And then Grant gets out of the military. He's done. He did his time, but he's ready to move home, and he's more or less a failed businessman for the intervening decade plus before the Civil War. So Grant's friend Pemberton, military buddy. Think of it this way, and this is how I think about it. Say you were dead broke, and you have a family, and you have a kid, and you have no money. Just everything you did, you didn't, it's not like you went to Vegas and you put it all on red and lost it because you were immature
unlucky
or irresponsible. You were just plain unlucky or incapable of doing anything with it. Who would you go to?
If I needed money?
Yes. Think about. You don't need to answer the question. Just think about to be in that situation, to be so humbled and so broke that you need to go to someone. You're willing to go and ask for someone's charity. Who would you go to? And for me, it would the first person I would probably go to is one of my closest friends in the Marines. Dude that was he's my oldest daughter's godfather. He's still single and he has no kids, so I know he has money. That's one of the reasons I would ask him. But I also know that the relationship we have from the Marine Corps, and we only spent about 18 months in the same unit, and then we've bounced into each other, but we've been friends. It's not like we've lived together for years or lived in close proximity or been neighbors. We did what Marines do. We spent a couple years together in a unit, and we became close friends. But that's the person I would go to first, probably before asking any of my family members for money. And that's what Grant did. He went to this guy named Pemberton, his buddy from West Point, guy that he went to war with, and asked him for a loan. And the guy said no problem. So that's Grant. And then the war starts, and Grant He had a good record as a young officer in the Mexican-American War. In his service, he was recognized as being very competent. The Civil War kicks off, and he's out in, I want to say Illinois, but he's out west, and so he offers up his services in the cause of the Union, and is, I think, given a commission eventually as a colonel. And Grant's book has so many good just lessons in it, and so it's his first. He's kind of doing a movement to contact. I forget the town's name, but Grant's doing a movement to contact, and it's going to be his first battle as this colonel. And he's approaching where he suspects the adversary to be. He's got one more IV line or one more hill to cross before he'll be in kind of direct fire range of this guy. And in his book he describes how anxious he is, and it's an anxious moment. I remember my first deployment, and the first time I was on what was called the Quick Reaction Force right at the beginning of the deployment, and one unit was in contact, and so we got stood up and we're going to go out into contact. So this was going to be my very first, contact. So it was a little bit different than like I was already out on the patrol and someone shot at us for the first time. It was, okay, I know I'm going into a firefight. I could not tie my boots. My hands were shaking so bad. I pulled them tight and I stuffed them in my sock and I got going because my hands were just shaking that bad. So when Grant talks about the anxiety that this had, and he'd already been under fire, and he had these, there's these crazy stories about him in the Mexican-American War, rolling over on the side of his saddle and using his horse as a shield as he's running messages and running resupplies back and forth to units in contact. But he really focused in his book about this first engagement in the Civil War and how nervous he was. And then he crests the hill and he looks down to where the adversary was at, and no one's there. And it looked like they had just beat a hasty retreat and were not seeking conflict or contact. And what Grant writes about that is he recognized at that point that the adversary was just as nervous and just as anxious as he was. In fact, more so, because that guy ran away, whereas Grant kept pursuing. But he said that was a turning point for him in the Civil War, in recognizing that, the adversary is just as nervous, and that as long as he masters himself in those situations and he can press on, that may be the turning point, or that may be the little bit extra that it takes for victory. So Grant progresses a series of battles. He's promoted to general, and eventually, and I'll skip around on the Civil War because I'm going to kind of just more tell really cool Civil War stories than regurgitate my understanding of the history of it.
You know what the people want to hear, sir. So everybody wants a cool military story.
Yeah, right. So there's Battle of Shiloh, devastating battle, and Grant at some point he'd been linked up with this guy named Sherman, and Sherman is a righteous dude, right? Sherman had a nervous breakdown, and he came to Grant with hat in hand, because Sherman had literally, like, he just clammed up on the battlefield in one of the previous battles, and he offered Grant, and he was senior to Grant. He was senior to Grant, and he apologized, and it's a pretty cool exchange. But basically, he humbled himself to Grant, and Grant gave him a second chance. This guy that had failed monumentally in a previous battle, but Grant knew him, or Grant saw something in him, and he gave Sherman a second chance, and Sherman was just devastating after that. I mean, he was the go-to guy. It eventually culminates with his march to the sea, but this is earlier. This is 1863, right around 4th of July, 1863. So I think it actually started in May, but Vicksburg on the Mississippi. It's this. I've never seen the city. I really want to see and do the battlefield tour there, but bluff overlooking the river, dominant terrain, dominates the river, would be hard to attack. It's a fortified position. And for weeks, Grant is trying to figure out a way around this. He's trying to capture the city. He's doing whatever he can to defeat the forces there. He's kind of northwest of the city on the Mississippi. This is one of the great stories with this Admiral Farragut that has all these riverboat steamers and gunboats that he's running up and down the Navy, and it's an Army-Navy amphibious type operation, and that's where the quote, "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead" was that's where Farragut said that. It's a famous Navy quote. He knew that there were basically river mines and obstacles out in the river, but he saw a gap and he said, "Damn them, we're going for it." So it's Sherman and Grant and Farragut, and they're working together, and nothing's working. Nothing is working, and eventually, Grant he develops a plan. The Confederate forces there knew Grant was important. They knew Sherman was kind of wherever Sherman was, that's probably where the fighting was going to be, and that's where they needed to concentrate. So Grant has Sherman doing all these marches and kind of feints and limited engagements on the north side of the city to get everybody oriented on the north side of the city. And then he goes well to the south, like 20 miles to the south of the city, and crosses over the river, and he cuts his supply lines. So he doesn't have a plan to have any kind of long-term logistical line of communication built across the river where he's crossing. He's taking a force, and he's crossing. He's going to cross the river, and he's going to take his chance on cutting his supply lines, breaking with what he learned at West Point, because that's the only military schooling that those guys get. But going against everything he learned at school, but what he saw work once before. None of the school book answers were working for him at this point, so he goes back to what he'd experienced once before and crosses the river. What I find really fascinating about this battle too is that Grant crossed the river, but he didn't go directly towards Vicksburg. He was thinking 1 and 2 steps ahead of his adversary there in Vicksburg. And so instead of going directly to the town, he cuts across and goes overland, and he destroys 2 railroad junctions that would be the only place that the adversary could reinforce Vicksburg once he lays siege to it. So he's already showing that he's 1 or 2 steps ahead of everybody else. So he destroys those. The South can't reinforce Vicksburg, and Grant lays siege to it, and eventually that's where the adversary in Vicksburg sues for peace and asks for terms. Under what terms can I surrender my army? And that's where Grant said, "No terms but unconditional surrender." So it's almost it's like an insult. If there's such a thing as gentlemanly war, that would be considered an insult. Not even allow like officers to maintain their sidearms or to allow cavalry to keep their saddles or something along those lines. Unconditional surrender. You get no terms in this. The Confederate general in Vicksburg was Pemberton, the guy that Grant was so close with that when he was flat broke in between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, that he went to that guy for a loan. And that is, you read about these civil wars, like, you can read Thucydides, and that was a Greek civil war, and try to imagine it. But this, for me, when I read about something like this, and I think how close
the time period is,
and
to the point that you can relate.
Yes, that you can relate, and you think that if that's my best friend that I'm fighting. What has caused us? What has caused such enmity and animosity that we are so, our view of what is right in the world is so completely different that it's led us to this point. And that's the thing about the Civil War. There's one of the parts about it that is just so fascinating to me. there's this American philosopher, Mortimer Adler's his name. He writes a lot of really good books. He actually wrote a book called How to Read a Book. It's a pretty decent read on who'd have known you could write a book on just how to read a book, but it's actually
Does it just go through the alphabet and then like teaches you actually like simple reading, or
no, it's it's more of you know, when you pick up a book and it's how to digest the information in the book, how to understand what the author's points that they're trying to make is, or if you know if it's
process and interpret.
Exactly.
Interpret.
Yeah. But Alder writes he writes a ton of really good books, but he wrote one about the kind of the philosophical underpinnings of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Gettysburg Address. And in that book, he's describing, you know, that America was founded as a republic, but the consequences of the Civil War and the amendments to the Constitution is what allowed it to become a democracy. And you think, you know, that there's so many things, and we're still, you know, there's still things that we're dealing with from the founding of our country that aren't completely reconciled, but that war was fought as a manner in which to form a more perfect union. And and it ties back to the Constitution, because if you read the preamble in the Constitution, if the founders would have just wrote, in order to found a perfect union, well, what is perfect? And how do we know when we've achieved it? But when they add that simple word "more" to the preamble of the Constitution, then it kind of changes the whole connotation of the thing. And it's an acknowledgement that it's not perfect, but that so long as we have good men and women of this country endeavoring to make it a better place, we are all part of this, and you know, all part of this forming of a more perfect union. Not just elected officials, not just, you know, people in uniform, but everybody that has, you know, every citizen, every person with the right to cast their vote in elections. So, you know, all those. The more I've studied the Civil War, the more I've seen how those things connect to one another, and it's especially for the Civil War, it's so much more of the tactics on the battlefield and the design and all the military aspects. It's the soul of who we are and defining who we are and who we want to be and who we really envision ourselves as a country and as a sovereign nation, that still you can still look at them and you can say that they're right and good, and that's a legacy that I want to protect, and it's a legacy I want to continue. And it's not like I knew that when I was, you know, 22 years old and I joined the Marine Corps, but it's something that I think the more realization that that's how I want to spend my life is what's kept me in the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps has been my opportunity to, you know, to make the best contribution that I think I could possibly make. So, and that's a long story about Vicksburg. Vicksburg's fascinating.
Well, so Pembroke, right? Like he was just basically insulted by his once best friend. Like, is there any historical documentation that says how he reacted to it, or?
It was. I mean, he was a defeated general on the battlefield, but I don't exactly remember. There is in the Samet annotation, but there's nothing he could do. He was paroled. He was out of the conflict, and that was that.
And I guess he didn't lend him any more money anymore.
Yeah, Grant always seemed like Grant always needed his money. He was
he's bad with it.
Yeah,
that's why you need it. That's why you need a good G8.
Mark Twain actually came to him and Grant was sick at the end of his life, and convinced him to write these memoirs, because Grant was broke again at the end of his life, and the memoirs at least secured the some level of financial security for his family, because he died right after he completed the memoirs. And like Mark Twain wrote that he thought that Grant only held on long enough to complete the memoirs so that he could, you know, on his deathbed provide something to his family that gave them a little bit of security.
Mm.
But
did he, I know this is an odd thing, but this is one of the things I wonder about. Did he write it while he was sick, or did he have someone write it for him while he was speaking?
it was both.
Both?
Yeah, he I think there's probably a history about how it was actually done, but I think he wrote notes and he wrote events, but Mark Twain added the color to them, and because they're very humble. Like Grant tells this story when he was a young man about buying his first horse because he loved horses, and he saw this horse that he had to buy, and so he begged his dad for money, and his dad gave him $25, and so Grant goes to the guy with the horse, and his dad gave him $25, and he said, offer the guy 20, and if he doesn't take 20, offer him 21. If he doesn't take 21, and then all the way to 25, and then if he won't take 25, you're not going to buy the horse. So Grant goes to this guy that's selling the horse, and he goes, my dad told me to offer you $20, and if you weren't going to take that, to offer you $21, and if you wouldn't take $21, to offer you 22, all the way to 25. And the point of the story being, you can imagine how much I sold that horse for. So he has all these great, hilarious stories in there, but they're very artfully done. So I imagine that's where Mark Twain really helped his
spruced it up,
yes,
colored it up.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's all. This is happening 4th of July 1860. Around 4th of July 1863. 4th of July 1863. You move east. East from there, and you have General Rosecrans, Union General, on. He's on the move, and he is attacking towards Chattanooga, Tennessee. So another huge battle. And I'd never been to Chattanooga until earlier this year, and the terrain around there is incredible. It's incredible. So
just for like aesthetics reasons, or just for warfighting?
Both. Well, both, but I'll start with Lookout Mountain. So we're on Lookout Mountain, and really what the terrain is Lookout Mountain, and all the big hills are actually not hills. They're what remains from glacial flows and from the rivers washing away the silt. But they're tremendous elevation differences between the top of like Lookout Mountain and the ground below. And so we're standing on Lookout Mountain. There's this awesome park ranger there. I mean, this guy was, you want to talk about a historian. This dude that was there, I mean, he was a machine. And I learned, it was just one of those guys that I am just learning at the cyclic rate as he's talking. And he's given us an orientation, and we're standing on Lookout Mountain. We're looking down on the river around Chattanooga. And, the river it comes up to Lookout Mountain, and then it bends back to the north before it finds some other terrain to flow south again. And he's telling us about the island. There's a little towhead island out there, and all the Native American. It was a burial ground for ages for indigenous peoples that lived in that area well before the country was founded, or even colonials landed at Jamestown. And so he's talking about how the mountain itself was a holy land, or considered a holy place for these indigenous people, and that's why their why they think their burial grounds were right at the foot of the mountain. And I was thinking about that. I was like, yeah, I mean, you have this mountain standing here by itself, and if you had, if you're if it's 3000 BC, and you're an indigenous person in the wilderness in this part of that continent, and there's a sole mountain setting there by itself that seems to make this river, if you have no concept of nothing that we know now, just what
at the time.
Yes, at the time, it appears that this mountain is actually making a river run back upstream before it goes downstream, and this mountain would be, I would consider it a special place as well. So it's really fascinating terrain. and getting to it from kind of the northwest where Rosecrans came from. I mean, those guys were I learned this from the Ranger, the way that the wagons were built in this part of the conflict. The spokes were built specifically so they were the most efficient for groups of people to grab them by the spoke and turn the wheels, because the hills that they were crossing were so steep that the horses couldn't pull them, and it took men on the spokes turning the spokes to get the wagons up and over the hills and onto the next piece of terrain. So it's interesting about Rosecrans is that in 1863, in this period of time, you have Vicksburg, you have Chattanooga, and you have Gettysburg all happening the same week. And this was all President Lincoln pushing towards action, and moving things, getting towards a decisive conclusion to the conflict. And Rosecrans gets a hard time because he was slow to move. But after seeing that terrain and reading why Rosecrans was slow to move, because he needed, triple what the book said he should have needed for wagons, but he needed that much because no one could take into account the amount of vertical movement that he was going to have to do. And he really did after understanding it a little better, a tremendous job of anticipating how hard this movement through that kind of Tennessee terrain is going to be. So Rosecrans is on the move there, gained some victories, and he's gaining entry into into the valley around the Tennessee Valley, eventually replaced by Grant, while in the east you have Gettysburg going on. So I'm going to kind of move to the east and move back in time a little bit. In September, you have the Battles of Bull Run, and you have kind of the Eastern Theater, all the battles that happened between Richmond and Washington, D.C. So the two capitals of these two, depending on your viewpoint, two different countries are 93 miles apart, and their armies are just continually clashing between Richmond and D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And for everybody that's been in that environment in the summer, it would be a very, very hard place to fight. You are sweating and walking through forests until you get to a clearing, and then it's just a melee of cannon fire and skirmishing until a decision is achieved, and then you're either retreating or advancing to the next river, and it's just a continual battle between rivers. But Antietam, I kind of focus on Antietam in September of 1862. I've been there 4 or 5 times, and that may be the best, at least in the continental United States, the best place that you could possibly go, stand in one position, and see the entirety of a battle and how it would have played out. Because you can stand almost where Lee's headquarters was on a little hill, and you can see the 3 main engagements, the cornfield, the sunken road, and then Burnside's Bridge is a little bit hard to see there, but you can see the train leading down to Burnside's Bridge. So it's not like Gettysburg where you can see bits and pieces, but you can't see the totality of the battle in one spot. So Antietam, you have Robert E. Lee, and he's convinced that an attack into the north is going to inspire some of the border states to turn and to secede from the Union and to join his cause, and so he leads this campaign through the Shenandoah Valley and crosses into Maryland and is on the move. One of the objectives that they seize on the way is Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is an incredible place too. I mean, you can see why that Harper's Ferry has been it was a pit stop for George Washington prior to the 7 Years' War when he was exploring towards Pittsburgh, and and it's just a natural point of kind of terrain where terrain drives people crossing the land there. Incredible place. Shenandoah and the Potomac meet there, and when you're looking kind of south and east, it's just like it's another world's opening up when you're looking back towards Washington D.C., where those two rivers meet, because they're just huge. There's huge mountains on either side, and then there's this little corridor and just in a beautiful, incredible area. And really, Stonewall Jackson, he sees that, and he leaves behind his top lieutenant, this guy named A.P. Hill, and then Lee's on the move to Sharpsburg, and that's where this guy named McClellan had been. He was now General Lincoln's top general. He was 34 years old, and he was general of the Army of the Potomac, so the Union Army in the East. And he relished in the fact that his nickname was the Young Napoleon, and he studied everything that he could get his hands on, and that's how he viewed himself as this grand marshal. And he was a very effective organizer and trainer. He took the army that had been beaten at Bull Run and ran back and was hiding, around D.C. He organized them. He had them equipped, and he led them in training. And he really did a good job of preparing this army. But then once General Lee actually crossed into the north and was beginning to threaten really Baltimore, D.C., but more so Baltimore, Lincoln thought that he had a general that would be able to take decisive action, but McClellan probably read too much Jomini, and he had to have things perfect before he acted. So he was slow to move, but he does move out. And remember, I moved back in time. It's 1862. Things aren't going well for the Union, and the character of the conflict is evolving as well. But McClellan, he pushes out, and he leads what is a very, very uncoordinated attack onto Lee's position in Antietam. And the statistics, the rate of casualties produced at Antietam was something the world had never seen before in modern warfare. And the amount of artillery and the employment of artillery, but I mean, I think the Union, when you're standing there where Lee's headquarters was, the first action took place at this place called the Cornfield, and it's almost directly north and about not even a mile from where Lee's at. But there's this valley, and there's still to this day a cornfield in it. So when we'd go visit it in September, if it was planted to corn, the corn's would have been about 5.5, 6 feet tall back then. The Union's able to approach through this cornfield, but the Confederates, they laid their artillery on it, and as soon as the Union emerged, I mean, they just fired for effect. And I think it's something like 5,000 casualties in, I think, less than 10 minutes, or it's unbelievable. So we talked Hannibal, and he killed 50,000 people in an afternoon, and it wasn't quite 50,000 people in an afternoon. But what was new was it was mass-produced machines killing at a longer range at a faster rate than anybody had ever seen. That's happening in Antietam, and that happened there, and it happened again at the Sunken Road, where that would have been close in, just slaughter. I mean, it would have been, the Sunken Road itself it's as wide as this room is, and that's what they were fighting over. But in between two hills that are 100-ish yards apart, and then you move on to Burnside Bridge. Burnside, he offered multiple times to not be a general. He's the one guy I found in the Civil War that he said, "I'm not up to the task. I don't think I can do this," and he still kept getting promoted, even though he lodged complaints about his own capability. So this is the first time he tries to cross a river, and he has no luck. And Burnside's Bridge is a crazy place, because it's only shoulder to shoulder, you can fit about 5 people across it, and the river that it's a bridge is over is only about knee deep.
Mm.
Burnside just kept throwing people at this bridge instead of crossing anywhere else. He just kept throwing them at the bridge, and they were just slaughtered as they concentrated on the bridge. But he eventually got across. He broke out and almost was threatening General Lee until A.P. Hill, in the nick of time, made it to Sharpsburg from Harper's Ferry, ran into Burnside's flank, and basically stymied Burnside. At the end of the day, however, Lee withdrew. And he withdrew back to Virginia. And that, although it wasn't a complete and total and decisive victory, it was enough of a victory and enough that the Union Army was standing there at the end of the day that President Lincoln could issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm-hmm.
And so President Lincoln emancipates the slaves in the southern territories, but the Emancipation Proclamation itself did a couple of different things. It stated the objectives of the war as ending slavery. And by doing that, Europe and France had both been on the edges of supporting the South in the war, but both those countries had also they'd ended slavery in their own domains, and so it moved towards eliminating them as being able to come in on the side of the South, because they were countries that had eliminated slavery, and now they're supposedly supporting a country that is the belligerent for slavery in a war about whether or not slavery is a legal right in a country.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was McClellan did enough for in that situation that it allowed President Lincoln to issue that. So that ends 1862. Lee withdraws back to what eventually he's set up around Fredericksburg, and then you have this epic series of battles crossing all the rivers: the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the Occoquan, I think there's one or two other ones in there in this area between or in this area of Virginia between Richmond and D.C. Every river that crosses that place north to south, there's Civil War. There's a Civil War battle and a Civil War story that goes along with it. McClellan's fired. He wouldn't follow up, and I can't remember. There's also some controversy because McClellan he hated Lincoln. I shouldn't say he hated him, but the manner in which he spoke to the press and to the public about President Lincoln, it would baffle people that he was allowed to say that out loud, and that President Lincoln didn't fire him earlier. Because it's not like there wasn't. There was no Twitter, there was no social media, electronic social media,
mm-hmm.
but there was enough newspapers from across the spectrum, both political and societal, and Lincoln got a hard time in the papers. He was not universally loved at all at this point. In fact, there was, not even 50-50. He was probably less than 50% of the people that there was a lot of people that questioned him, and there was a lot of hatred that was expressed towards him from within the Union itself. Of course, the South was going to dislike him, and McClellan would be Lincoln's primary competitor in the 1864 presidential election. So he doesn't go away. The young Napoleon doesn't go away, and he's loved. He's loved by a lot of folks. But anyways, 1862, winter of 1862 into spring of 1863. Really, the battle in the East had settled around Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, and there's attempts at crossing, in the bitter winters down, the bitterest of the winter down there, trying to assault into Fredericksburg, and it's repelled, and the Union just having no success whatsoever. Eventually, this guy Hooker is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army in the area, and he launches an assault. This is kind of May 1863. Very uncoordinated attempt to attack across the Rappahannock, and this is the Battle of Chancellorsville. And it's an epic battle. Again, Lee, the victory. Depending on how you define victory, a lot of people say that Lee was the victor in this, but he lost more leaders. He lost Stonewall Jackson, and it was what's called a Pyrrhic victory, where many more victories like that, and you're not going to have a force left to fight with. A lot of it was Hooker's own doing and just an unskilled manner of employing his forces. But what's fascinating is it sets the stage for Gettysburg. And so you kind of have almost a seamless end of this battle. This battle ends in May, and then Lee is arguing with Jefferson Davis and with the Confederate Secretary of War, and they want to send him out west. Where Rosecrans had just is starting to push into Chattanooga. They think that battle is the more important battle to fight, but Lee convinces them that he might, basically he's got to throw a Hail Mary right now, and this is why he attacks again into the north and to towards Gettysburg. So all so Lee, pretty much all of May and the early part of June is actually just the forces, Lee moving out into the Shenandoah and Hooker trying to get more forces. He's fired. This guy named Meade takes over, and Meade does nothing to change Hooker's plan. So Hooker gets a hard time in history a little bit because all the mistakes he made in Chancellorsville. But what's fascinating to me about Hooker is that he recognized all those mistakes at Chancellorsville, and he fixed them all. Some of them were the way that his corps were arranged. Some of them were very simple logistics things, in the manner in which he employed his artillery created traffic jams so that the artillery couldn't get from point A to point B because he decentralized it to a level too low to allow for the logistical organization of how its resupply wagons would be moved around the battlefield. Hooker recognized all this. He fixed it all. He reorganized the army real quick. And so when Meade took over, Meade did very little to change any of that, and it ultimately worked to the Union's favor at Gettysburg. Gettysburg is just, if you haven't been to Gettysburg and you have an opportunity to go, you just have to go. It's just
It's
one
awesome.
of the most incredible. Have you been there?
I have.
Yeah, I mean it's just incredible, the monuments and the testament to the battle there. So I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but I'm from Gibbon, Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
Gibbon was a division commander just forward of General Meade's position that held his division held the line at the high water mark of Pickett's charge, and Kearny was another division commander, and Pleasanton. Kearny has a Walmart and a couple of stoplights, so it's the metropolis of where I'm from. There's a Target there too. I think they got a Starbucks now.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the
still no stoplights in my hometown.
Yeah. I mean that sounds like the pinnacle of modern industrial cities, or I forgot what they call it. What do they call it? That sounds like the pinnacle of metropolitan areas.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's about 30,000 people. I mean, it's a big city. It's
got
a one-way street.
Mm-hmm.
It was really confusing for me from the age of about 16 to 17 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Pleasanton's Kearny's where my dad's from. Pleasanton, Nebraska is where my mom's from. Pleasanton was a cavalry leader for the Union Army that kind of set the stage, for a lot of this stuff. So these battles are raging, and the Union emerges victorious but exhausted again from Gettysburg, and that's kind of the high water mark. But from from Gettysburg to Vicksburg, across half the continent of the country, and really the totality of the country. I mean, it's comparable. The distance, people were captivated with Napoleon's march from Paris to Moscow and back, and that's a comparable distance. Napoleon did it on foot, and these armies are fighting in 50 years beyond that, in a time where we're moving thousands of people by railroads that have been in place in times that just like it is like warp speed for people's imagination at this point. And this American Civil War is the first industrial war. It's not just that the railroads are there. Railroads are being built just to support this conflict. Railroads are recognized as, the speed and the scale that you can move forces around continental distances in a conflict had never been done before, and it's being done here. The telegraph, probably the best and the worst, with like President Lincoln at Antietam, is that McClellan was on the telegraph with the White House the entire time instead of leading the battle, because every time these armies stopped, a telegraph would be established instantly so that they could communicate back to President Lincoln, who was keenly interested, and he had educated himself on military matters, and he took a leading role in military decisions. I mean, I think he's probably one of the most involved ever, if not the most involved ever, president in directing the actions of the military with this technology that is relatively new, but the technology is also, from a comstrat side, pictures of the battlefield and stories of the battlefield and the devastation on it. I mean, the first battle at Bull Run, people were out there picnicking and watching. They thought was going to be some quaint little skirmish that would decide, that would account for the decisions that are being sought as it related to the states' rights and slavery and those kind of things. And then, a year later, it is slaughter. It's slaughter by best friends in certain circumstances. It's torn families apart, and it's this epic battle, epic war that ushered in a whole use of new technologies, where neither side was really, in any given battle, every one was a close run event. Every one of them, there was opportunities taken and opportunities lost that could have led to victory for either side. But in the long run, you have an industrial capacity available for the Union that just wasn't there for the for the Confederates. So, man, I could talk.
I know you could.
I don't even know. I don't know where to start or where to stop. I think I was able to communicate, the things that
you wanted to talk about.
There's
so much history behind it. It's hard to talk about it all.
Yeah,
and with our hour time,
There's I'll just close with the movie Lincoln that came out a couple years ago is based off this.
Not the Vampire Hunter one, right?
Yeah, not that one. I haven't seen that one. I like my oldest child's name is Lincoln. If that tells you,
yes, it does. It tells me a lot. It tells me a lot.
My feelings, but it fits too. We're from Nebraska. The capital of Nebraska is Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
We have the same initials, but there's the biography of Lincoln that led to that movie about him by Doris Kearns Goodwin, I think, is the author. The epilogue in it is this anecdote about a traveler European traveler in one of the stands, kind of that region of Eurasia, that came upon a small village, and this is early 1900s, where they had heard stories of President Lincoln, and they'd heard the way that the stories had been communicated by the time it got to kind of the edge of civilization, where this village was, Lincoln, they thought he was a god. They thought he was a god because of the epic nature of this battle and this war, and what this country America was, what this country America, had, what people's idea of it was, and this, this person that, or this entity that led it through this trial and brought it together for, the good of the world. And I just think that that's so fascinating, because when I think back to the stories that I started with on the last podcast, and the Iliad, was it real, or was it just this idea of Homer? Who knows? Whereas the American Civil War, it was real. It is real. It is this epic story of a society, and how a society determines its values and determines its legacy, and how it, what it's willing to do to become a more perfect union.
Mm. Well, next up we'll be following those epic stories with stories about World War I and World War II, if I'm correct, right?
That's right.
I have a lot of personal interest in World War II, so I'm very excited for that. All right. Well, thank you again. Can't wait to have you for the next episode. This concludes this episode of the Third MEB Podcast. I appreciate you tuning in. Remember to stay ready, resilient, and relevant. You have a great day.